Something strange had been happening along County Road 7 for about 3 weeks before people started talking about it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was just odd. Every morning, before the sun cleared the tree line, a teenager could be spotted pulling rotting timber from ditch banks, from the edges of cleared pastures, from behind old barns where wood had been left to decompose for years. He wasn't stealing. He always asked first, and that confused people even more, because what he was asking for, nobody wanted. He wasn't taking the good oak. He wasn't taking the straight cedar. He was taking the stuff people had given up on. The logs so far gone, they crumbled when you kicked them. The wood that smelled of earth and mushrooms and slow, quiet decay. Old Walt Hendricks, who'd farmed the ridge property for 40 years, offered the boy a full cord of clean split firewood, free of charge. The boy smiled politely and said no thank you. He'd take those 2 rotten sycamores behind the fence instead, if Walt didn't mind. Walt did mind, or at least he didn't understand, and around here, what you don't understand, you laugh about. By the end of that first month, people were calling him the rot collector. Kids at the feed store repeated it. Grown men said it with a shake of their heads. And somewhere between the laughter and the head shaking, nobody thought to ask the most important question of all. What did that boy know that they didn't? Months later, those same neighbors would pull into the Puit farm driveway and walk those same fields, and not a single one of them would be laughing. If stories about ordinary people discovering extraordinary things inspire you, hit subscribe and join our growing community of people who believe the land still has lessons left to teach us. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. These stories travel farther than we ever expect, and we love knowing where they land. His name was Callan Puit, 17 years old, quiet in the way that some people mistake for simple, until they spend enough time around him to realize it's something else entirely. A kind of patience, a tendency to observe before speaking, to think before acting. Callan had lived on the Puit family farm his whole life. 63 acres outside of Harwick, Missouri. His grandfather, Emmett Puit, had worked that land for over 50 years, first with horses, then with machinery, then with a stubborn, aching body that refused to quit even as the farm slowly began to. Because the land was tired. That's the only word for it. The topsoil had thinned over decades of conventional tilling. Water ran off the slopes instead of soaking in. Summer droughts turned the garden plots to cracked clay. Yields dropped year after year, not dramatically, but consistently, the way a slow leak eventually empties a tank. Emmett planted more to make up for it, worked longer hours, spent money on fertilizer that provided short relief and long bills. He wasn't a failure. He was a man doing everything he'd been taught to do, by his father, by the county extension pamphlets, by the culture of farming he'd grown up inside of. He just didn't know there was another way. Callan had started to wonder. It began with a library book, a battered paperback on regenerative agriculture that a neighbor had donated to the county branch when she cleaned out her late husband's shelves. Callan checked it out 4 times. Then he found himself down rabbit holes online, watching farmers in Germany, homesteaders in Oregon, growers in the English countryside, doing things that looked almost counterintuitive, letting leaves accumulate instead of raking them, planting in raised mounds, burying organic material instead of burning it. And then he found it, a practice with a German name he had to look up how to pronounce, hugelkultur. He didn't tell his grandfather about it right away. He didn't tell anyone. He just started driving the county roads with the truck bed empty, and coming home with it, full of the one thing nobody else wanted. News travels fast in a county where not much happens. By the 4th week, people had theories. Some thought Callan was collecting material for a bonfire. When he didn't light anything, they assumed he was building something, a shelter maybe, or a compost pen. When nothing recognizable appeared, the speculation turned into comedy. Dale Fricke, who farmed the 2 parcels east of the Puit place, watched Callan haul a load of punky, crumbling elm into the lower field one afternoon and called across the fence, "Boy, you know that stuff won't even burn right." Callan nodded. "Yes, sir. That's kind of the point." Dale repeated that line at the diner for a week. What people noticed, if they watched long enough, was that Callan wasn't being careless about any of it. He wasn't just throwing rotten wood in a pile. He was sorting it. He'd roll a log over and crouch down, examining the underside. He'd peel back sections of bark with his pocket knife, studying what lived underneath. He carried a notebook. He made sketches. He measured distances. He consulted books with bookmarked pages, dog-eared from repeated reading. He was building toward something. Anyone who looked carefully enough could see that. The problem is, most people weren't looking carefully. They were laughing. And when you're laughing, it's hard to see much of anything clearly. Here's what those neighbors didn't know. Those rotten logs weren't meant to be burned. They weren't meant to be stacked into a wall or nailed into a fence. They weren't raw material for any project those men could picture from the road. They were something else, something that most conventional farmers in that county had never heard of, had never been taught, had never had any reason to consider. But what exactly? That answer was still forming, literally taking shape, in the lower field of the Puit farm, where Callan had started doing something that no amount of roadside watching could fully explain. By early April, the lower field looked like something between a garden and an archaeological dig. Long raised mounds had appeared, some as long as 20 feet, some shorter. They weren't flat-topped like raised beds. They curved. They were irregular, and something was clearly buried inside them, because you could see the earthwork had been built up around and over material that gave the mounds their unusual height and shape. Nobody knew what was in them, and Callan wasn't explaining. His grandfather, Emmett, had watched the whole thing with a complicated kind of silence. He hadn't stopped the boy. He hadn't encouraged him either. He'd spent 50 years learning what worked on this land, and he wasn't confident this was it. But something in the way Callan worked, that quiet, unhurried intensity, kept Emmett from saying the words that would have ended the experiment before it had a chance. Neighbors predicted the mounds would wash away in the first rain. Neighbors were about to be half right. 3 nights of heavy April rain came through Harwick County. Over 2 inches in 24 hours, the kind of rain that pops up sinkholes and floods creek beds. 2 of Callan's smaller mounds eroded significantly. The slope on one end had been too steep. The covering layer hadn't been deep enough. Water had carved channels through the exposed side. He stood in the field in the mud and looked at the damage. He didn't swear. He didn't quit. He took photos and wrote notes. The neighbors had a field day. Told you so. Traveled around the county faster than the rain had. Dale Fricke drove by. Slowed down. Didn't stop. But Callan saw the satisfied expression and turned back to his notebook. He rebuilt. He adjusted the angles. He added deeper topsoil coverage. He changed the orientation of one mound to better match the natural drainage of the slope. He studied how the logs inside the damaged sections had absorbed water, and noticed something important. Even after the erosion, even after the exposure, the interior of the mounds was dramatically more moist than the surrounding soil. The failure had told him something the success hadn't yet. He was listening. Now let's talk about what Callan had actually buried in those mounds, and why it mattered more than anyone on County Road 7 had imagined. Hugelkultur, the word is German, meaning roughly mound culture, is one of the oldest soil building techniques in European agriculture, practiced for centuries in Eastern Europe and rediscovered by permaculture designers in the 20th century. The principle is almost embarrassingly simple. You bury rotten wood deeply. You mound soil and compost over it, and then you plant into the mound. Here's what happens next, and this is the part that changes everything. Rotting wood is a sponge. A single decaying log can absorb hundreds of times its weight in water. During rainfall, those buried logs drink deeply. During drought, when surrounding soil becomes dry and hard, those logs slowly release that stored moisture back into the root zone of whatever grows above them. No irrigation pipes, no water bills, no hauling. But moisture retention is only the beginning. As the wood continues to decompose underground, it becomes a city. Beneficial fungi thread through the material, forming networks that connect plant roots to nutrients they couldn't reach alone. Earthworms arrive by the thousands, drawn to the organic activity. Microbial populations explode, the invisible workforce of every healthy soil. Nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, the nutrients that fertilizer bags try to replace, begin releasing slowly, steadily, across years and even decades. The rotten logs Callan had collected weren't garbage. They were infrastructure. They were a slow-release system that conventional farming had traded away for tillage and chemical inputs, without ever realizing what had been lost in the exchange. The reason Callan rejected healthy wood matters too. Fresh timber doesn't decompose fast enough. Worse, it actually pulls nitrogen from the surrounding soil during its initial breakdown, the opposite of what a young crop needs. The soft, crumbling fungi-threaded logs that everyone else had thrown away. Those were already past that stage. They were ready to give. He knew which logs were right by looking underneath the bark, the ones with white fungal growth, the ones that smelled of mushrooms rather than mold, the ones that broke apart gently in your hands. That's what he'd been sorting for all those weeks. Not junk, evidence. Dr. Sandra Wolk, from the University of Missouri Extension, came to the Puit farm in late May, referred by a county conservation officer who'd heard about the project and was curious enough to make a call. She walked the mounds slowly. She took soil samples. She crouched and dug and examined. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "This is hugelkultur, done properly. Do you know how rarely we see this implemented correctly on a first attempt?" She explained to Emmett Puit what she was looking at, how the biological activity beneath those mounds was already measurably higher than the surrounding field, how the moisture content was holding at levels most farms in this county couldn't achieve, even with drip irrigation. She said that in 5 years the soil above those buried logs would likely be among the most productive ground in the county. Not because of chemicals, because of biology. Emmett listened with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He'd been farming for 50 years. He'd never heard any of this. "Why didn't anyone ever tell us about this?" he asked. Sandra paused. "Because it's slow. Because it asks you to trust something you can't see. And because it doesn't sell anything." The summer drought of that year hit Harwick County hard. It came early, mid-July, and didn't let go for 6 weeks. Temperatures above 90 for days at a stretch. Dale Fricke lost nearly 30% of his vegetable crop. Other farms on the ridge looked like they'd been burned. Pastures went brown and brittle within the first 2 weeks. People drove past the Puit farm and slowed down. Not to laugh this time. The lower field, the field with the mounds, was green. Planted with squash, tomatoes, beans, and sweet corn, the rows were full and heavy. The plants weren't just surviving, they were producing. Not because Callan had run water to them every day, but because 6 feet beneath the surface of those mounds, a network of old rotten logs was quietly doing exactly what they were designed to do. Releasing moisture, feeding roots, holding the ecosystem together through the dry weeks. Dale Fricke called and asked if he could come by. He brought his son. They walked the field without speaking much. Finally, Dale said, "I owe you an apology, son." Callan shook his head. "You didn't know. Neither did I. A year ago." Word spread the way good things eventually do. Slowly at first, then faster than anyone expects. Agricultural students from the state university came to tour the mounds. The county extension office cited the Puit farm in a newsletter about water conservation practices. A retired homesteader from 2 counties over drove in just to shake Callan's hand. Emmett Puit watched all of it from the porch, a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. One evening in October, when the field was resting and the light came in flat and golden across the mounds, Emmett found Callan sketching plans for a second set of beds along the north fence. "I spent 50 years trying to fix this land," the old man said, "and it took you 1 summer to show me what I was missing." Callan looked up. "You kept it going long enough for me to have something to work with. That was your part." Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then he went back inside. But those who know him say he stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that, watching the field in the evening light, and that his expression had changed into something that hadn't been there in years. Before we wrap up, if you enjoy stories like this and want to learn the real farming wisdom that's been passed down through generations, I have something special for you. I wrote a book called 101 Farming Secrets Grandparents Knew: Timeless Country Wisdom for Healthier Soil, Bigger Harvests, and a More Self-Sufficient Life. It's filled with 101 practical, time-tested lessons on healthier soil, bigger harvests, natural growing methods, and self-sufficient living. If you'd like to own this collection and revisit these timeless techniques anytime, you'll find the link in the description below. I hope it becomes a valuable resource on your farming journey. Now, let's get back to the story. The writer and farmer Wendell Berry has long argued that how we treat the land is inseparable from how we treat each other. That a culture that destroys its soil is one that has stopped thinking about the future. He believed farming was not merely an occupation but a relationship, and that the health of that relationship showed in the ground itself. Callan Puit didn't read those words and build those mounds. He built those mounds, and then the words began to mean something. There's a lesson that runs through this story that goes further than farming. Most of the things the world discards, the rotting, the crumbling, the overlooked, the already given up on, are not worthless. They are simply misunderstood. And sometimes, the only thing standing between failure and transformation is one person who decides to look underneath the surface. Those rotten logs didn't suddenly become valuable when Callan hauled them home. They were always valuable. The world just hadn't learned to look at them properly yet. If this story gave you something to think about, a lesson about soil, about patience, about seeing what others miss, share it in the comments below. And tell us where you're watching from. These stories are meant to travel. Subscribe for more stories about the land, the people who tend it, and the quiet wisdom that grows in places most of us pass by without slowing down.